I have decided that I'm going to create a mixtape. And this mixtape will be representative of me. So I've got to come up, I've decided, God willing, and the creek don't rise, I get at least 60 years. I hope for more, but let's go for 60 is a nice round number. So 60 songs. We'll see how that goes. I've so far only got record 1, side 2. So still work in progress.
That is a clever idea.
All right, son, you ready to go?
I am ready to go.
Hello, welcome to Hard Compound, an American take on Formula One. No race this week, no race for several more weeks, but son, I think this will be a fun episode. We started this show years ago, an American take on Formula One, and now America is taking on Formula One, maybe taking over Formula One. So I want to get all your thoughts on the rise of Formula One in America and how America is impacting F1. Ready to start?
Yeah, let's do it.
You know, we started this Hard Compound because it was you and I watching Formula One in the early morning hours on NBC Sports, if we could get it. Rarely was it even live. And we thought more Americans need to know about Formula One. And then we started this podcast and Drive to Survive hit, and it went crazy. It was huge. Suddenly everyone we knew claimed to be an F1 fan. Some were being honest, some just jumping on the latest trend, but I think all realized it was an awesome sport. Fun to watch, fun to talk about. Why don't you give me some of your early memories of Formula One?
Yeah, F1 I just sort of stumbled upon it, I think. Way back when it was still being shown on NBC Sports here in the States. I think I don't remember exactly the first race I watched. It might have been Spain in 2010. But I just remember Alonso and Vettel going at it. And that was Alonso's first year at Ferrari. It was the year that Seb Vettel won his first Formula One World Championship as a driver with Red Bull. And that season came down to the wire between those two drivers. And I just remember being captivated by the way Alonso was driving in that first race I ever watched. And I knew nothing about the sport at the time. I didn't know who any of the drivers were. I didn't know what their careers up to that point had been like, or obviously what they would go on to become. But that drive from Alonso sort of impacted me in a way that brought me to the sport, and he sort of became my official favorite driver. Little did I know that he was a 2-time world champion at that point. I think that was probably my earliest memory of Formula One.
Awesome.
And we went on to sort of together, just sort of embrace the sport and enjoy it together. And I think, 13 years later, here we are.
So more than half your life. But it's funny because, there was a minor controversy. The president of FIA suggesting that Formula One itself is not worth the $20 billion that the Saudis are reportedly offering for it. When we started watching it together on NBC Sports, I'm not even sure Formula One was getting any rights. I think it was back when they were sort of splitting the advertising money, F1 in America and NBC. And those ads were, liquid plumber ads, for example. It wasn't like, buying an Aston Martin. So it's pretty amazing to see the growth in just the last 13 years. For me, it's much, much further back. I grew up in Detroit, the Motor City. We got to see some NASCAR and a lot of IndyCar. And on the weekends, we got a half-hour sports show, Wide World of Sports, and Jackie Stewart, though he was retired then, co-hosted a lot of segments, and we would sometimes get to see a few seconds of an F1 race, maybe highlights from Monaco, for example. And it always just captivated me. It was like amazing athletes, amazing machines, racing all over the world. And back then it was, even though I couldn't really watch any races back then, it was just a few seconds of highlights every week. You could almost still view it as somewhat of an American sport. I mean, Mario Andretti was still there. I believe Eddie Cheever was maybe still there. I would be watching a lot of the Indy races, Indy 500 in particular, were always on network television. And so I did get to see some of the races, or parts of the races, from even back in the 70s and 80s. In the 90s, that still wasn't really shown in America. It was still very difficult to see any races. You might catch Monaco on a tape delay. But that's when the cars were being fitted with more and more sensors, computer code, really beginning these sort of incredible development of composites, for example. And, me as a techie, that really attracted me. I mean, there were even articles on some of the F1 technology in Wired magazine back when that was a factor, covering the tech world. So it's pretty amazing. And now here we are. Millions of Americans will likely watch season 5 of Drive to Survive on Netflix, which covers sort of a somewhat insider view of Formula One. How about this? In our recent predictions show, we said there would be an 11th team and possibly a 12th team by 2026. There'll be some new engine regulations. I believe the new fuel regulations, the fuel will all be, I don't know. We can't really call engine fuel green, but it will be, sort of somewhat more sustainable. There are more and more rumors that Mario Andretti, has big money, American backing of being that 11th team, even backing of General Motors and its division Cadillac. Do you sense any? Do you think that's going to happen? And do you sense that sort of the old boys club European sort of dominance, and in particular the UK dominance of the sport and the coverage of the sport, are sort of unfairly holding back America's entry into it?
I think that there is a very real possibility that we'll be able to see an Andretti-backed team enter Formula One in a few years. We're getting other big names coming into the sport. Audi and Porsche are really sort of fighting for a spot as well. And so, it seems like there is opportunity to enter the sport, even though it seems sort of to be outrageously expensive, and sort of nobody's willing to help. And as you mentioned, the sort of Euro faction of this sport seems to not really want any entrance or any more entrance into the sport. If it really does have a $20 billion valuation, well, there's 10 teams. I mean, that's sort of $2 billion a team. If you then split that between 11 or 12 teams, you get less of that pie. But it does seem like there is this shift, or at least there's a push from Americans to enter the sport. I don't know how likely that is, that it will happen soon, but I think it will happen eventually. I think that there's a real question of where that team will be based out of, though, right? We have an American-owned F1 team in Haas. They are based in the UK, employ mostly Europeans.
Mostly Italians, I think.
So it's really, I don't know if you can call it an American team. I would really like to see an American team based in the US and sort of showing off the engineering capability that resides here in North America. I think that would be a lot of fun, really cool to see. And with more and more races and drivers entering the scene, I think it would be cool to have a real American team in the sport.
I think that will happen. And I think at the latest by 2026, there will be 3 races in the U.S. starting in 2023. F1 is building a massive semi-permanent presence in Las Vegas. If you look at the geography and you count the money, there is no reason why there can't be 4 F1 races in America. You get 4 F1 races in America, plus the presence in Vegas. You can have at least 1 testing week in America and maybe even make that permanent. That's 4 to 5 weeks where it's all focused in the U.S. Right now, the existing teams and F1 and FIA, which are all intertwined, they're more than happy to take the American money. More American viewers, more Drive to Survive viewers. They're happy to have Google as a sponsor, Oracle as a sponsor, all the big American tech companies as a sponsor. They want to maintain control. And, as more and more money from America pours into the sport and more fans, I think ultimately America will rest, if not full control, at least part control of Formula One. And I do think with 3+ races in America, we will see a true American team as well. Right now, as you said, we have 1, Haas, but as you mentioned, they're based in Europe. They employ a lot of ex-Ferrari engineers. They don't have an American driver, but Logan Sargent, an American, will be driving. He's going to be the first American in a long while who will have a permanent seat in Formula One. So there are some movements. For example, there is no team better at branding and hype than Red Bull. Red Bull is going to show off their new car for 2023 in New York City, here in America. I think that means something. Ford has said they are going to have at least a marketing partnership with Red Bull that could develop into something more. Red Bull obviously doesn't want to hand over any control of its operations, but I think that's a way for Ford to get back in. The Andretti team bid is a way for General Motors to get back in, plus all the massive tech money. So I think it's only a matter of time before we have yet another race in America, a true American team, maybe even a second American driver.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all a very real possibility. Just on the driver front, there are going to be 3 Americans, rookies in F2 this season. And as we're very well aware, F2 is the sort of last stepping stone on the way to F1, or sort of out of that that sort of sport track. So if we're getting three new American drivers in F2, it seems likely that there's a possibility that one or multiple of them end up coming through and into F1. So there's just more drivers, more money, more people interested. I think there's definitely a future there.
But, that makes me think about the whole Colton Herta saga. He's an Indy driver, an American. He has tested for F1 teams. He certainly can compete in an F1 race. He was essentially prohibited. He didn't have enough so-called super license points. And while in theory the super license is valid, I think if you look at this example, it was once again the sort of the Europeans sort of trying to make sure they maintain control over the sport. It's like, no, we're not going to let some American who's a proven Indy driver who can clearly compete in F1. We're not going to allow him in. You have to come through essentially F2. Even if you buy your way, like Nikita Mazepin did in F2, you have to go through our gates. And so I just think that's another bit of bias that I think eventually will fall down. I think as we're seeing F1 drivers go into Indy, we'll eventually see 1 or 2 Indy drivers just bypass the whole F2 system and jump straight from Indy to F1.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think if you look at the super license breakdown in points, the points are awarded the same way in F2 as they are in Indy. But I think Indy is probably more challenging to succeed in than F2 is. If you're, say, a young driver, your first couple of seasons in Indy, you're going against 10, 15, 20-year veterans of the sport in cars that are essentially identical. There are a few pieces in there that are different, engineering wise. But in F2, you're going against guys that have maybe been in F2 for at most a couple of seasons. So I think there is a bias there as well, in the breakdown of points awarded, super license points awarded to these different competitions. Because frankly, I believe Indy is probably far more difficult to succeed in than F2 is.
Yeah, I agree. And we've also seen a number of F1 drivers jump to Indy, or when they retire or lose their seat in F1, come to Indy and do fine, but not necessarily great. They don't dominate. This is the cars aren't exactly the same. The tracks aren't exactly the same. Plus in Indy, there's a lot of oval tracks. But, it's not, the F1 guys don't take over. They've got to fight it out. There are some things about F1 that are sort of silly that as Americans we love. for their silliness. So, for example, a lot of American fans or new American fans that I meet seem confused by the whole excitement and the pomp and circumstance over the introduction of the new livery. Firstly, they don't really know what a livery is. Essentially, it's the decals. It's the look of the car. You want to talk about livery and sort of all the pomp and circumstance about that?
Yeah, well, liveries are funny because that is a very European thing. I mean, if you look at soccer, all the teams, show off their kits every season, and they have a home and away and a third kit, and there's always people who wait for that and are excited by it, and often can be disappointed by it as well. But yeah, in F1 they do the same thing. They just show off what the car looks like. There's no real you don't get a sense of what the car is capable of until testing starts a few weeks later. So really, you're all there. To me, as an American, it's almost like the NFL draft. You know how everybody shows up to the NFL draft, and especially in like the second or third round, when teams pick a guy, and all of the fans there just scream and cheer their head off, and that none of them have any clue who that person is. To me, it's the same thing with these liveries. They unveil the car and everybody goes crazy. And it's like, yeah, but this is just what the car looks like. It has no bearing on whether or not it drives fast.
Right. It's a fun thing. Usually Ferraris, I think Ferrari does the best. Maybe then Red Bull and their sister team AlphaTauri. But the others also do good. Sometimes Williams has had a classic livery. Mercedes maybe has a good livery. McLaren will often have a classic livery or do something that just looks so cool. But it is a bit of silliness. Though to be fair to the teams, it's where they finally get to show off, because even though there are 20 plus races around the world, each race is more about the setting, the locale, the track, and not necessarily the team that made that car. And so this, showing off the livery, even if it can be silly at times, it's just kind of a fun thing that I think a lot of American fans or newer American fans just sort of don't quite understand. Now, one thing, I've been watching Formula One probably longer than most fans have been alive. And one thing that I've never warmed to, that like the hardcore European fans just can recite like savants, are the names of turns in particular tracks, which I've, it's like, there's this turn in Silverstone, this turn, in Monza. And I'm like, which one is that again? That's something I've never been able to grasp.
That's like, it is very weird. I think, because there's only a few where it's like that should be iconic, right? It's like, I don't know. Everyone always like, oh no, this amazing thing happened here 134 years ago or whatever. I don't give a shit. Who cares? Who even knows about that? Right. But yeah, I mean, the naming of the corners is, at this point, I just think it's silly. Especially on like newer tracks, like at Silverstone or like Spa or whatever, I guess, maybe. But the issue for me lies in like, well, I don't know which corner that is. Where is it on the track? If you say turn 4, I'm like, oh, okay, I know where that is. Oh, turn 16, that's the last one on this track. So they're coming around to the start-finish straight. Like, okay. But the second you throw in random names, how the hell am I
Right.
supposed to know where they are?
Right. So, it's like I'll be at the Detroit Grand Prix later this year, and it's like, oh, I'm at turn 4. I know where turn 3 is. I know where turn 2 is. I know where turn 1 is. But oh, did you see what happened at Jericho? I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Oh, you mean turn 2 of the street race in Detroit? Okay, now I get it. It's kind of silly. Another silly thing, and the world needs to thank America for saving the English language, is the silliness of some of the words they use, like curb. I'm like, that's not really a curb. And if it were, it would be spelled CURB, and they spell it KERB. Or when they talk about, we're hard compound, it's like, oh, we're switching to the soft compound. And like, tires, TYRE. And I'm like, no, that's wrong. So there are some sort of English centric elements still to F1 that I do enjoy, even though trying to explain them to a new American fan can be difficult.
Indeed.
One of the things about America sort of jumping into F1, embracing it, fans showing up, we've had, I think, COTA, the track just outside of Austin, Texas, had the most attended race in F1 history. I think last year, or maybe 2 years ago. They're building the massive presence in Las Vegas. Miami is sort of fixing the track. There were a lot of complaints about the first race this past year in Miami, and they seem to have taken them to heart and are fully committed to making that a great race and a great race weekend. But Americans will spend big money on sporting events. And already, we haven't even had our first Grand Prix in Las Vegas. Well, not since the early 80s, but in the new Las Vegas Grand Prix starting this year. And I mean, it's like 3-day packages are going for $30,000, and that's sort of just the standard. That's not the high end stuff. The high end stuff is $100,000, $500,000. So that's kind of one of the downsides of the American, I don't say takeover of Formula One, but sort of, jumping inside and making its presence known is all the money and the cost to the real fans.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that's always the hard thing about when something becomes very popular. It frequently becomes far more expensive. It's that whole economics, supply and demand, and if more and more people want it, then you're going to have to pay more for it. Because in the U.S., sporting events, frankly, are very expensive. I mean, just going to like a hockey game, which nobody cares about in the U.S., seems like, it'll still cost you like at least $100 to go for one person.
Yeah. One seat at a hockey game. You're right, and it's not a very minor sport in America
either.
Right. And I think maybe Europeans don't realize how much money Americans spend on sporting events and how much businesses do, and how well attended they are. Probably the top 10 to 20 university football teams bring in about 90,000 to 100,000 fans in the seats every weekend. More than you would get at a Premier League event, for example.
Way more.
Right?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I think, that it's crazy how popular just sports are in America and how much people will spend on them. And I think, well, hopefully, as we start to get these races in the U.S. more consistently, seats, passes will, will become cheaper. I'm hoping that it's the first race in Vegas in 60 years.
40.
Is it 40? Yeah, I don't know.
I'm pretty sure in the 80s, Patrick. I'm not that old.
80s. Okay. I'm hoping that those passes will come down, become cheaper for people to actually get to see the race. I'm hoping that this is just sort of first season hype. Everybody wants to be at the first one. And I think that eventually, the average person will be able to attend these race weekends, because they're obviously a lot of fun. People have a great time there and they're well attended, but if only people with 35 grand in just expendable money can go, then it doesn't really make sense.
No, I agree. You want that. I mean, the tickets for Indy races are radically less. So that will have to be something that I think F1 looks at as we don't really want to price everyone out of being able to actually attend a race. I do think that's one reason why they're adding more and more sprints is, going on Fridays and Saturdays, obviously cheaper for practice and qualifying, and sort of having there be something that impacts the season, that impacts the standings, like a sprint, for example. I think that's one way F1 is addressing the cost issue, but hopefully they do more. On the other hand, the downside of all this American money is, you're pricing a lot of fans out. But one thing that we have in America is a commitment to professionalize sports. When I was just a kid, F1, they were amazing racers, amazing cars, but you could still be a guy running a mechanic shop and build a car and get in that car and really go balls to the walls and compete. That's gone. America professionalizes sports. I can remember in the 90s, for example, like the early MMA fights or cage fights, we called them. Some of them were actually silly. It's like, we could watch these amazing boxers and then we'll see this where two guys, get into a cage and somebody submits because he's got his fingers pulled back or just something silly. But they professionalized the sport to the extent where these are now the best fighters in the world, for example. They're radically superior to just one generation ago. And I think we are going to see, the rise of, for example, more Max Verstappen's. He's not just a great racer. He spends his free time in sims. Everything is sort of focused on racing. And we're now doing this, even like in American football. The children start certainly by middle school. And if they show the size and talent, they'll have professional coaches, professional camps. Everything is geared toward them being the best football player they can, the best baseball player they can. So I think the professionalization that Americans embrace will have a lasting and potentially profound impact on the future of F1.
I think that's very fair. We see that in all sports in the U.S. And if you want to grow the sport, there's sort of a way to do that. And I think we can see that in several different ways in the States. If you look at MLS, the way that they have tried to gain more popularity and improve the sport, that's a very American thing to do. They're not so complacent and just accepting where they are. I mean, the NFL is massive, and we keep getting every single year, people that want to create new football leagues, the USFL or the XFL. And the way that they've gone about doing that has actually allowed those brands to stick around, at least for more than one season. And I think if we're talking about F1 and the role that America can play in F1, that's definitely one of them, making it stick everywhere, not just in the States, but for the whole globe to sort of embrace the sport and make it bigger, and actually have that $20 billion valuation.
Yeah, and Americans also, sports are a respite. Sports are something that everyday people are passionate about, and they focus on it and will buy the fan gear and support their teams, support their players. They take a very short, not nasty, but they don't particularly like people trying to pull the sport into other directions, into social issues, cultural issues. They want to focus fully on the sport. Sometimes I think a lot of people may think that's a bad thing, but over the long term, I think it keeps the focus on the sport itself, which sort of keeps it thriving. One thing Americans do not seem to understand with F1, speaking of the professionalization of sports, is the notion of daddy drivers. In America, this would never happen. And there's one real exception, which is still in racing, even in Indy racing. In America, children are identified from a young age as potential gymnasts, skaters, football players, basketball players. They have coaching every day. They go to camps during the summer. They have all the equipment at their disposal, the training, and they make it or don't. In F1 and in other races, the cost is so much. No one just has an F1 car around, or even an F2 car lying around available. There is this thing called daddy drivers, which is if like Nicholas Latifi, for example, who's no longer in F1, your father is rich enough, he can buy part of an F1 team and make you an F1 driver. The notion just does not compute with most Americans. And I always just sort of find that interesting, that they don't seem to still understand that it may seem unfair because Americans love the notion of fairness, but it's still something that may be necessary just given the cost. However, I do think that will change, and ultimately we'll see the very notion of daddy driver become part of history. What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's like a very high school sports thing in the States. I think we can frequently point to players of any sport who tried out and beat out somebody far better than them for a spot on a team because of the pull that their parents have in and around the school system. Maybe they're friends with the coach, or they're on like the union board or whatever. So like in that sense, I think people can maybe get an idea of what that's like. But I think with the introduction of the super license to F1 and the growing sort of popularity of the sport, I think people don't want to accept anything but the best possible 20 drivers or more, depending on how many teams there are. And so I do sort of agree with you that I think that will phase out, that we won't get too many more of these drivers who probably should not be in the sport, but are because of who their parents are. That only came about sort of recently, right? I mean, like you were saying, back in the 70s, 80s, whatever, you could start a team from your garage, and the way you would have to compete is with the best driver. So you can't just accept a bad driver for some extra cash. It only became really a part of the sport after it took off. And there was far more money involved in the sport. But yeah, I think before too long that will go away.
Do you think we'll have more than 3 races in the U.S.? And if you do, where do you think we might see them? New York, California? I don't know. Detroit? What do you think? Indy? I mean, having an F1 race in this day and age in an oval seems close to impossible, but you never know.
Yeah, I think that probably wouldn't happen. But I can see more races coming to North America in general. I think like the New York or Boston would be cool. San Francisco area, I think, would be cool.
Do you think street track or maybe like a converted Indy track, like Northern California, Monterey area, or maybe street track like Long Beach?
I think a street track would make a lot of sense. But if you could convert certain tracks to the way that F1 cars work or are designed, I think that would be cool too, right? If you look at like Laguna Seca, I don't know if an F1 car can make it around that track without like getting damaged. But it would be very cool to have a car go through there.
Yeah, Laguna Seca is north of San Francisco, right? Or I'm thinking of Sonoma.
No, it's south. No,
that's
Monterey
like Monterey area.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that would be cool. Even the Sonoma Raceway is fun. I'm just not sure that you could, brand F1 in Sonoma, California, but maybe. But no, I mean, I think you could have another Canadian GP. Vancouver, Toronto, or Ottawa would be very cool. I think you could have another Mexican GP. Put one on either coast. Those would be like, I think they would be fun. I think they would be extremely popular. But
Toronto has,
I think it would be several years out.
Right. I think if we're going to do Canada, it'd be very cool to see it F1 in Vancouver. But given the size of Toronto, they already put on an Indy race. That might work as well. But yeah, that's a great idea. It doesn't just have to be America. What about North America? So yeah, another Mexico, another Canada race. That would be a lot of fun. Okay. Crazy predictions time, Patrick. I have been talking up my idea of a Champions League or a Seniors League like they have in golf for Formula One. I don't think it would be possible, but Lewis Hamilton may only race a couple more seasons. Vettel's retiring. Alonso's in his early 40s now. Imagine in 3 years, those three as part of a Champions League. Maybe bringing back Kimi Räikkönen, getting a few others from Indy and so forth. I just love this idea. And I just think that would sort of immediately boost the popularity of F1 in America. Any sort of crazy predictions for the rise of F1 in America and or America takeover of F1?
I don't know if I have any real crazy predictions. I like the Champions Tour idea. I think, the average American likely doesn't know who most of the drivers are on the F1 grid. They've probably heard of Lewis Hamilton, or some other world champions, but for the most part, they probably don't know who else is driving in Formula One or who has driven in Formula One. But getting those big names to go on and compete against each other in this Champions League, I think would definitely boost interest in not just motorsport, but in F1 in particular. And I don't expect that to ever really happen. But if it did, I think I would watch it.
Nice. Yeah, I would love that. I'm not sure I have any crazy predictions. I think right now the interest in F1 in America is growing so much. There's so much money pouring into the sport that the remaining big American auto companies are obviously taking notice. Ford is looking to sort of build a marketing partnership. I think General Motors is looking to build a marketing partnership. My crazy prediction is nothing substantial comes from that. That's not to say Americans' presence in F1 will slow down anytime. But, like it or not, the American auto companies seem fully focused on high margin SUVs and maybe juicing the stock price by embracing electric vehicles. I'm not sure there's a pathway for them into Formula One as far as actually being a constructor or building power units, for example. I wish that wasn't the case, but that's not my crazy prediction. I guess that's my rational prediction. What do you think?
I fully agree with that. I would love to see another Ford Cosworth team up power unit. Might be the greatest F1 engine of all time.
That's way back, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I don't see why they would suddenly decide to change their minds about about sort of what they do. Right? All, like you mentioned, pretty much all American auto manufacturers don't really care about F1. There's frankly very little interest in motorsport in general. They are making plenty of money on cheap products for them to build and engineer. And I don't expect them to want to do anything else to disrupt that or take resources away from that, or really spend resources on anything else.
Yeah, I think it won't come from a traditional American auto company. I think we'll see maybe, for example, Apple Computer. Not only are they worth, hundreds of billions, but I think what Christian Horner and Red Bull have done is sort of the future model, through branding and just execution and hiring the right talent and staying in the sport through all the ups and downs. They'll now be, essentially the fifth winningest team in Formula One history. I think if not already, they will be soon. They're going to be building power units. They've built a massive presence. They're fully committed to the sport. You could not have predicted that even 20 years ago. They make drinks. They make, non-alcoholic beverages. You couldn't have predicted that, I don't think. And so what I think is we're going to need to see some American company that gets enough of a marketing benefit and has the money and foresight and commitment to stay in the sport, to become a true lasting force. I'm here in Detroit. I'm happy to help, but I do not see that from GM or Ford or the sort of Borg Chrysler company we have here. So, unfortunately. Okay, I wish to thank our fans. Remind you, send your questions or comments to hardcompoundpod@gmail.com. We may read them on the show. We definitely will read them. And I wish to thank you again for listening to everybody's most beloved father and son F1 podcast. And we are Lights Out.
See ya. Thanks for listening.
Hey, I thought that was interesting. I thought we took a good, honest look at America's presence, America's commitment, all the new fans, all the new money, some of the potential upsides, some of the potential downsides.
Yeah, I thought it's good. It's very interesting to look at it like that. So.
I heard there will be a new season of Drive to Survive coming out next month. I have decided to no longer pirate the show. I will get a subscription to Netflix. I have done that. I started watching the show Stranger Things, which is fun. It takes place in the 80s. A lot of people tell me it takes place in the 80s because for plot points, you can't have iPhones and everybody loves the music. And I say, no, that's wrong. It takes place in the 80s because that was the last decade children were allowed to be alone. And the entire show is essentially children running around fighting monsters, and the parents are nowhere ever to be seen.
That's funny. I just, I don't disagree, but yeah, it's becoming more and more unacceptable to leave kids alone.
Children have not been left alone since Reagan left office, Patrick.
Even when I was a kid, though, like, I would walk home from school and, like, I don't know, I had a couple friends where we lived, and I would just go to their house. I had no way of communicating to you where I was, and I would just show up at 7 after dinner, whatever. So I don't know, now it seems like far less likely for kids to be alone than when I was younger.
Yeah, it does not happen. Bad things happen. Your children will be fighting monsters if you leave them alone.